English translation, 877th contact. Saturday, 3rd February, 2024, 14:12 hours.
Excuse me, please, because I have been held up. But welcome and greetings.
Thank you for your welcome and greetings also, my dear friend. You have no need to excuse me, for I have observed you feeding Selina and hurting her.
Well, it was not meant to be.
That is not what I want you to worry about, though, because if I waited a few minutes, that is why.
It is not like the world is going to end.
Of course not. But what I would like to see now is the draft of what you have put together regarding the announcement of Michael's weekly information program on the internet, and also regarding the special time signal.
Oh, I am afraid I forgot about that. Bernadette wanted to download everything onto a stick and give it to me. But I will phone her straight away. Here it comes in the printer already. Look here.
That is good and correct so far, but...
The phone, it is Bernadette. Just a moment, please. There is just a back and forth.
Then it can be left as it is. It will probably be correct if this information is included at the end of every interview report from now on. This here, Zeitzeichen Sonderausgabe, should, however, be named the other way round, so Sonderausgabe Zeitzeichen, with this also being a bold print.
Okay, then this is done. But here I have noted a question that I was asked. Like Wendell himself, I was supposed to keep quiet about this during his lifetime, which I also did. But now that someone has come across the fact that Wendell took photos of UFOs at the restricted military area in southern Nevada, and thus at Area 51, which is known because of the Roswell incident, Robert Lazar and experimental airplanes, etc., I can talk about it now, since Wendell is no longer there. Well, Wendell has left us and has nothing more to fear from the American henchman, because of whom he also had to remain silent, otherwise he would have been captured by the American Military Intelligence Service. He was also ordered to keep quiet about the fact that he was allowed to fly around with her a few times in Ascot's beam ship, and also see the future. However, it was still not enough to prevent him from being arrested and imprisoned, even though he was completely innocent, as he was unable to defend himself against the intrigue being waged against him by the upper management. What can be said now is that the photos and films he took at Area 51 were made with my cameras, which I had lent him, and I also took care of developing the slides and films, because it was too hot for him to have them developed in America. The slides and films were also too hot for him, which is why Ascot and I advised him not to publish them, after which he finally destroyed them in Ascot's and my presence. He only kept a few pictures that were unknown to me, or took them later with a camera that did not belong to me, because I had no knowledge of them and did not have them developed. These photos are also known and circulated today, but where he took them, I really do not know. But they were obviously taken over a sea, and they show a UFO and an American fighter plane that are completely unknown to me. But as I said, I do not know where these photos were taken, and I cannot ask Ascot, because she is not here, and I also do not know whether these photos were taken in her presence. And if I look closely at these photos, they do not show a beam ship of you Plejaren, but something foreign, which is probably a UFO of the foreigners, from whom you have always kept your distance, so I also do not deal with them. Although I have been able to observe their flying apparatus twice from the center, the first time in 1979, when Guido and I were at the concrete mixer, and the floor for the Medi room was being concreted. The object we saw flying over the military's Bloodhound missile base was golden yellow, about 2 meters long, oval, as seen from us, and shining brightly. Our observation distance was about 600 meters or so. Such observations are also being made all over the world at the moment, as they have been for a long time, and also here in Switzerland. But this is officially kept quiet, as in this case here, when I was able to take the pictures of Sim Ya-se's beamship and the military fighter or jet fighter in the Maiwinkel. And that this was indeed the case is proven by this letter here, which was sent to me by post today of all days, along with many others, on the occasion of my birthday, but which I unfortunately cannot copy, but can only transcribe, which is certainly permitted if I do not mention the name and address. What do you think?
I also understand that way.
Then I will read this out, but then only write that if I call up everything that I think is answerable. Esteemed and honored Billy Meyer, I was, and a friend of Erwin Murner, but unfortunately, he has passed away. In any case, I would like to congratulate you on your 87th birthday, but I would like to inform you of all the events that took place when I was in the Maiwinkel area and saw the strange flying object several times at the time. I did not know that it was you who was standing there on the road armed with cameras taking photos and film footage, as I was able to observe when I saw the strange flying object. To be honest, I was not only astonished by the strange flying object, which was unknown to me, but also kept quiet about it and destroyed my recordings, as everything only took place because I had observed the flying object on M, and so it became a secret matter that. So that, and here it still stands. I just want to inform you, but please destroy my letter, because I am, and I do not want that to happen. Erwin assured me, however, that you have complete integrity and know how to keep quiet. If I am. This is the part where I think this can be said openly, but the whole of what is written here describes everything in more detail. But it is certainly not important that this is also mentioned. However, you can read the rest for yourself. Here you go.
Thank you, this should already be important, but if you think so, do not. Ta. Yes, from here on it is also no longer important.
Yes, you are right, so let us move on to something else. But first, I will quickly shred this letter and the envelope. That is done. And now I would like to mention a few things that are happening on television regarding UFOs. Because there are now very frequent programs that refer to UFOs and foreigners, that is to say, extraterrestrials. Countless recordings are shown that are nothing more than ridiculous animations. That is to say, animated films are played and shown, which are then misleadingly regarded and understood as real by many of the television viewers. They also make very lurid assumptions and spread outrageous fantasies that are so hilariously stupid that some human beings almost choke on them. The sometimes very frequent occurrence of UFOs is immediately dramatized and even whipped up into hysteria, just as the whole thing is also presented as a great danger, and it is claimed that the blind believers of the viewers are frightened and terrified by the nonsense. This, while interceptors and fighters in various countries are actually tracking and trying to shoot down UFOs that have been sighted. This is downright earthly, as it is peculiar to the majority of Earthlings, that shooting and murder are carried out first before asking what is actually going on, what the purpose is, and what the justification for the whole thing is supposed to be. But shooting and killing first and not asking for the reason is typical of Earthlings, who have a guilty conscience and are therefore afraid and do exactly what should not be done. In the matter of foreigners and their UFOs, the only correct thing to do would be to seek contact with the foreigners in an absolutely peaceful wise, instead of pursuing them with fighter planes and attacking them by shooting at them, not with fighter planes, but also with guns from the ground. The thoughts and actions of the Earthlings responsible for this, who usually wear expensive military uniforms adorned with medals, think they are powerful, but in reality have such idiotic mouths that almost the entire universe can be swallowed up in them, which testifies to the fact that neither logic, understanding, nor reason is present in their brains. All this fictitious thinking and wrong behavior on the part of those responsible does not correspond to effective adulthood, as can be expected of a truly adult human being, but rather corresponds to the fictitious thinking of idiots who imagine that they are clever and clever thinkers and geniuses. In reality, however, they are incapable of any true and clear thinking. which is why they simply want to attack and shoot down the UFOs with fighter aircraft cannons or ground guns in a stupid, thoughtless, and cowardly way, full of fear. And they do this without knowing what the occupants of the UFOs actually want, where they come from, what they are like, and what species and kind they are. Instead of seeking peaceful contact with the crews of the UFOs, they viciously attack them and their flying apparatus, which, with their UFOs obviously equipped with some kind of futuristic anti-gravity capabilities, are able to maneuver around in our filthy Earth's atmosphere and evade or simply paralyze the idiotic and completely clumsy attacks, and all projectiles at lightning speed. In addition to the bogus thinking, false posturing and actions of the lowly intelligent and therefore non-thinking and idiotic military superiors, who order attacks, and the firing at UFOs, and thus probably only cause damage, because it is not known what the consequences will be. There are also liars, fraudsters and fantasists at work in the matter of UFOs, who also cause great damage. These are above all those who, against their better judgment and therefore lying, claim that they are in contact with the occupants of UFOs and with extraterrestrials, and that they receive and disseminate esoteric or divine wisdom and teachings from them. Although everything from A to Z is a lie and a clear fraud that is concocted in the sick brains of the lunatics in question. The true fact is that contacts of this kind are pure fantasy or deliberate lies and deception based on a desire for recognition, greed for money or other ambitions, such as a thirst for honor, ambition, respect, ambition, expectations, covering up weaknesses, as well as finding a life balance or a professional goal. But there are also charlatans who lie about alleged contacts with alleged UFO occupants in order to deceive other human beings and then ridicule them if they believe the charlatan lies. But there are also those who, as a result of sleep paralysis, dreamily assume and believe that they have been abducted by UFOs, that is to say their occupants, often claiming that they have been medically checked by the extraterrestrials, etc. However, I have to keep quiet about the other facts concerning abductions by UFOs, because I have no knowledge in this regard. The Earthlings, especially the military and those who are in favor of it, are geared towards cowardly solving any problems by force of arms, but this will never succeed, because a victory by force of arms never brings peace, but always only a state of affairs that threatens to force a new armed conflict or use of weapons and is intended to prevent that. If the truce is broken, new armed violence and murder or death penalty laws are used. As a rule, a military occupation by foreign might then prevails, which never leaves the country and remains there forever. This, however, is not a state of true peace, but a state of threat with constantly lurking armed force and the scepter of foreign gayvault and rule, as is the case everywhere in all countries where, for example, the Americans have stationed their occupations, as in Germany, whose false-feathered part of the rulers, the devil knows why, has always been war-minded since time immemorial. This was also the case in the last century, when the imperial government started the World War in 1914, because it intervened in the conflict between the Allies Serbia, Austria, Hungary in order to keep the skirmishes between them within limits. The imperial government was also keen to test the extent to which Russia stood by Serbia as an ally. And as bellicose as Germany's imperial rulers were at the time, Adolf Hitler was also obsessed with bellicosity and hegemony, just like the Americans from time immemorial, whose origins were actually also Germany, and who launched the First World War of 1756 to 1763, which, however, is wrongly trivialized by simply calling it the 7 Years' War. Well, even today, that nasty and war-loving part of Germany's rulers, whose mind is set on might, war, bloodshed, destruction, and annihilation, has been inciting the countries and their rulers and parts of their populations that are in bondage to them against Russia for so long that, in addition to their partisanship, they can also fulfill their lust for war. And so, as you said recently, Schwath already wrote in his annals in the 1940s that he and I together, with regard to this, everything will now be done by that fallible part of Germany's rulers until, possibly, another global war arises. That is to say, a world war of the kind that the old Reich government already unleashed in 1914 and then also Adolf Hitler in 1939. And America, whose Republican Party wants to withdraw from donating money, weapons and ammunition to Zelensky, that is to say, Ukraine. As Quetzal said recently, who observes and registers everything in the American government very closely, will be harassed by the fallible part of the German government. The federal chancellor himself will then be the one to go begging in the USA and make good weather for further donations to Zelensky. Through him, that is to say, via him, the German government is to harass America in such a way as to continue buttering up weapons, ammunition, and money for Zelensky, while also enriching itself, as Quetzal said. Germany's government, Quetzal also said, is the biggest warmonger of all countries in the world. In addition, his observations and findings and the analyses made also show that the current president of the USA has fallen into a high degree of senility, that is to say, senility, which means that he is not only physically, but also that his intelligence and the use of his brain and creative life energy are already reduced by around 42%. This was, as he said, an atrophy of the brain that was occurring in this man as a result of old age. He also explained that he suffers from memory loss, but also from a loss of cognitive abilities and confusion, as well as motor, and consequently physical and atrophic brain problems. The whole thing is a condition of dementia, but it also affects various physical functions, as a result of which he can no longer move around safely. This makes me wonder why this man, who is also a tremendous warmonger, is not removed as president of the USA, and a completely healthy and sensible human being takes over the office. Like those senior military officers who lack all logic, reason and common sense when they shoot at UFOs. The same is also true of all those who fearfully and cowardly, thoughtlessly, foolishly, stupidly and idiotically advocate everything in this regard, thereby evoking nothing but hostility. This is because they have nothing else in their heads but an underdeveloped brain that is only affected by a belief and thus by fear and cowardice, and is incapable of true thinking. True thinking and correct action without any religious or worldly faith is therefore in no way their strength, as could be expected of adult human beings. But they think, decide, and act confusedly and erroneously, in a completely confused and fear-ridden wise, and exactly contrary to what should really be decided and done in logic, understanding, and reason. And if I am already talking about the irrationality of the military, then it is in and of itself inevitable that I come to the acts of war in Ukraine and the Middle East, and to the traditional hegemony of the Americans. All of these are nothing other than criminal machinations. And the warring leaders of Israel, Netanyahu, Ukraine, Zelensky, Russia, Putin, as well as the head of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, and their ilk, are murderous criminals who effectively walk over corpses. And that is the full truth, when only Putin is labeled a criminal by the European hypocritical money elite, and in Germany by disguised neo-Nazi rulers, while everyone else is partisanly defended. According to all that I have just explained, it must be clearly stated and said that the part of those in power that believes itself to be grandiloquently powerful, but which only believes itself to be powerful, but in reality consists only of pretenders, fools, cowards, fearful people, and failures, is the one that incites the like-minded, lowly intelligent part of the population to do the same without thinking. The latter then acts just as lowly intelligent and simple-minded as the flawed and unfit of the rulers, the otherwise powerful and all other like-minded people of the same color. The result is that the large sections of the people, who would bring about the right thing through the small minority of truly logical, rational, sensible, and therefore truly thinking human beings on earth, so that true peace, true freedom, and security would arise in permanence, fail because they do not act correctly. This is because the correct decisions and actions and the power of their logic, which is not lacking, their equally clear understanding and adequate reasoning would really bring about success. However, this is stubbornly prevented by those lowly, intelligent, and simple-minded idiots in government and their supporters among the population, because they are not only stupid, but in their lowly, intelligent, and simple-mindedness, they want to be more than the normal and peaceful human beings of the citizenry, and impose all kinds of idiotic things on them, who are completely satisfied with their normality and do not present themselves to the outside world. Do not cut themselves open, do not make themselves important, do not present themselves as powerful or admirable and want to stand in the public eye and bask in it. This is in contrast to those who cling to their delusions of grandeur and might, which they use to influence the people and incite those sections of the population against the righteous, who want to set things right, but are labeled right-wing extremists by those incompetent rulers of injustice, and provoke extremism and hatred against them in that section of the population, who, as a result of the wrong governmental influence, are only too happy to let off steam against the truly righteous as a shouting, jeering, destructive, and viciously aggressive and possibly physically aggressive mob. This is what is currently happening in Germany, for example, in a roaring, idiotic, and pathological manner, where the people are being incited against that part of the population with lies by the fallible, power-hungry, and those incapable of true governance, driving them to demonstrations against the righteous, who, thinking for themselves, strive for the rights of the people and their effective freedom and want to enforce them. But the part of the blind and believing population pushes everything forward, as the falsehood of the rulers demand with lies, and thereby gain what they fundamentally want, namely to bring the people under their total control and completely choke off their freedom. This is what will effectively happen in the future if the people do not prevent it and do not take up arms against it. And it has to be said that if that part of the neo-Nazis who are in government and who call the righteous of the people right-wing extremists and incite the people against them just because they want what is correct and good for the people and the country, then the people themselves should make sure that such lousy elements in government disappear. If right-wing extremists really are labeled as such and their attitudes and actions as wrong, etc. by honest rulers with integrity, but in a wise and lawful manner, then there is nothing wrong with that. This is just in the wise way, in which a human being of integrity lives in honor and dignity, and acts in the awareness that all his insults, which is actually a teaching, are generally correct, as well as his personal attitude, his standards of his attitude to life. This, just as all his insults as a whole also correspond to his values, and the comprehensive value of his very own thoughts and behavior. In this wise, he also reveals his personal integrity and loyalty to himself, and characterizes him as an honest human being, who actually behaves honestly and openly in accordance with what he cherishes and cultivates in his thoughts, and also acts accordingly. Just as many things are done and decisions are made, actions are carried out, and behavior, etc. are displayed by parts of incompetent government officials with regard to incorrect things. So everything is done in equal measure to completely stifle and destroy the freedom of human beings in such a way that in the near future cash is to be taken away from human beings by law, and they are to be made completely dependent on a credit card, for which more than the first steps have already been taken, and these are becoming more and more widespread. The majority of the population has already adjusted to this in a lowly, intelligent, and simple-minded way, and is not thinking any further, as a result of which the banks, and also the governments in particular, will have a very easy time of it, and will be able to restrict human beings' freedom more and more to such an extent that they will lose it as far as possible, and will be more controlled than was ever the case at the time of the bailiffs. However, the majority of humanity does not think about this, but instead allows everything to happen to them in a lowly, intelligent, and simple-minded way, without any thought or grumbling, making it easier and easier for them to be bogged down from above. As far as AI, that is to say artificial intelligence, is concerned, the same thing will also happen in this respect, as I have already said with regard to the coming loss of freedom for human beings. But the majority of humanity also does not care about this due to its indifference. It is already clearly pre-programmed that every human being will be controlled to the hilt by AI, and will ultimately and inevitably be directed by it, and will ultimately rise up against humanity. Logically, this is vehemently denied by the originators and promoters, as well as by AI enthusiasts and AI fanatics. But none of them is capable of also giving a single thought to what the near and distant future will bring through AI.
You should emphasize this specifically when you retrieve and write down our conversation, because what you are addressing with your words corresponds to what. But that all are criminals, as you said regarding the war leaders. Those of the world shadow government who hold their secret meetings in Davos are also criminals. This is guarded by heavily armed police and military personnel numbering in the thousands, with snipers even posted on buildings, as our observations and investigations have revealed. According to our calculations, all of this effort costs a great deal of money for all security costs, whereby we estimate the costs incurred for all activities at around 12 to 14 million Swiss francs by Swiss standards. The super rich, some of whom have hundreds of billions in assets and manage many trillions in super corporations, and their meetings in Davos are secret, which is why they are not publicized to the people of Switzerland or to the world at large. The top secret meeting of the really small group of the super rich takes place in a back room of the Congress Center, where they hold their secret meetings. They are the power elite, a small group of super rich people who are on the way to creating a new world order and have already achieved a great deal through dark networks. This is in addition to what we have established, namely that evil and criminal machinations are being carried out with regard to the OPEC and IOGP organizations, which work together with the European Union operating in Brussels as a secret energy alliance, so to speak. This is being done in such an evil wise that millions of euros are being spent on working against climate protection, which is making a name for itself worldwide and for which serious demonstrations are also taking place throughout the world. The various giant petroleum, oil and gas extraction companies are not interested in the protests and demonstrations having a real impact on climate protection, but are instead interested in ensuring that the extraction of oil and gas continues unabated, to which the European Union is also secretly involved under pressure from the oil and gas extraction organizations, with horrendous sums of money also flowing in.
I know that because with Svath Ha, but there is probably no point in saying more about it, because only a minority listens to what is said and explained anyway. The majority of Earth's humanity simply turns a deaf ear, deliberately ignores everything that is said and explained regarding everything else that is not based on religious belief. But what you have explained, I will also mark in bold, but it is probably better if nothing more is said about it, and I turn to other and more important things. So the first thing I want to say today is this, without politicizing or engaging in politics, which I also never do otherwise, but only mentioning what is real and effective. Politicizing does not suit me, because I always remain neutral. I do not presume to have a political opinion of my own, but only express what I see and can observe, to which I can perhaps give neutral advice on what might be right to do through logic, understanding, and reason. But such advice is really always neutral and can be followed or not. And they are always and in any case based on the fact that I never have an opinion, but am purely reality-based. Observing, recognizing, ascertaining, and precisely perceiving everything that is going on, happening and occurring in reality, and how everything arises and behaves in reality. This is not a matter of opinion, but only of grasping reality and expressing it verbally, or in writing with appropriate explanations and words. Kristen Freiner has written quite clearly about what is so very important for Switzerland's government and security with regard to its neutrality, as has also former federal councillor Blocher, who was unfortunately ousted from the federal council by pseudo-Swiss members of the government. This was because he stood up for Switzerland and said what was and is correct and what is not with regard to neutrality, and what does not correspond to it and what it really is. Something that is not understood by those fallible people and those federal councillors in Federal Bern as by those parts of the fallible and incompetent co-governors in the National Council and in the Council of States, and is being muddled through by unrighteous and completely incompetent rulers. This is because, despite their age, the infallible and incompetent are lowly intelligent and therefore do not think in real terms, as are also many of the would-be young politicians, the Jusos of both sexes. This type of government misfits, the elements who clearly do not know what neutrality means, get their way with their treasonous ambitions and win because they are able to overbill the righteous. These nasty elements want to make pacts with foreign powers, such as the EU dictatorship, and even want to adopt their legislation and place Switzerland under their injustice. And because the effectively true and righteous Swiss are obviously in the minority in the government, they have no chance whatsoever of asserting themselves against the unrighteous and those nasty elements, who consequently simply push down the capable members of the government to such an extent that they are scrounged into the ground, have to kowtow and say yes and amen to everything that the unrighteous push through in this wise way. They pass this off nastily as democratic, and then mendaciously claim to the Swiss people that everything was done peacefully, rightly, and in a democratic wise, and that it was also decided in this way. However, it is absurd and wrong that a true democracy is not based on the majority winning a ballot despite dissenting votes, because a single vote is worth as much as 1,000 or however many other votes in an election. True democracy is therefore based on the fact that there must be absolute uniformity in elections, and that a majority does not win. Only absolute uniformity of all votes can be right, and therefore also permitted in a real and true democracy, whereby only absolute non-opinion, that is to say, full abstention, can be permitted. However, if a ballot is conducted in which the majority wins, then this corresponds absolutely not to the preservation of a democracy, but to a majority system of electoral governance that has absolutely nothing, and not even a resemblance to democratic governance. If the word democracy is understood in its value of origin, then it does not simply go back as a language to the ancient Greek compound word demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning might, power, rule, which emerged around 450 BC. The truth is that this term originated and was coined thousands of years earlier, around 11,000 years ago, in the area now known as Southeast Turkey, by human beings who were basically hunter-gatherers and who settled and began to farm. I remember this because I was there with Sfath, with a large group of human beings who were laboring together to build stone structures. They did all the work and decisions together. Everything and anything, which they called, I do not remember exactly, Orlakta, or something like that, which Sfath translated for me from their language as together. The meaning was that everyone worked together, everyone decided something together, and did everything together, and carried it out together, and so on. When Sfath spoke to these human beings, he was told that everything would only be achieved with the absolute agreement of all those involved, with not even one human being against it. It was said that if this turned out to be the case, that a resolution could not be passed on something that had been proposed, planned, or requested by just one human being, then the matter would be shelved. I kept that to myself all those years, and kept quiet about it. I only told a young man from Germany in confidence once, when he came to see me in Hinwil at the beginning of the 1970s about an article in a German magazine, I cannot remember what it was called, that had hawked my photos to H. Schuld. His name was Keller, I remember. His nickname was Klaus or something like that. He was about 20 years old and was very interested in UFOs. But when I told him that the Plejaren had nothing to do with them, as I also did not, he just wanted to know where in southeast Turkey Sfath and I were with the people who did everything together. After that, I did not hear from him again, But many years later, it was towards the end of the 1990s or the beginning of the 2000s, I cannot remember exactly, he then made an effort to find my telephone number and phoned me. He said that he had not forgotten me and had been following what was going on around me all these years, and that he was in contact with I, who was sending him all the information, but that I should not say anything about it. He explained to me why I should keep my mouth shut, and why I should also continue to do so, that well, anyway, he said that, according to my information, he had actually found old walls somewhere in southeast Turkey, a place called Gerlik or something, but I do not remember the name exactly, and that was probably the place where Svath and I were. And what I explained to the young man in Hinwil, the term Orlakta, which was mentioned to me around 11,000 years ago, had spread as a term, and even thousands of years later had changed again and again, and had been preserved in other languages and meanings, and had finally been taken up in Mesopotamia, and then much later, around 500 BC, in ancient Greece, and then later also brought to Europe, where it became known as democracy. He had researched this thoroughly and wanted to write a book about it, but he could only say something about it when he could also provide full evidence. He then also gave me Mrs. S' address, which I could contact, but he asked me not to ever officially mention her name because, unfortunately, I was no longer able to reach her by phone 2 months later, so I wanted to visit her in person with Marcel Hurt, and learnt that she and her person had been killed in a car accident in France. This also put an end to my contact with Keller, who I have never heard from again to this day, because if I now go on to talk about the concept of democracy, then it has to be said that it originated with the first peasants around 11,000 years ago in southeast Turkey, and since this became native to ancient Greece, it has given rise to the value of popular rule, which means that in a democratic state, the people alone are the sovereign of the state and have supreme state power in every respect. All political decisions are therefore made solely by the united will of a population, but not by a majority, that is to say, not by a majority of votes. Consequently, only a single vote against makes a ballot invalid.
In our view, democracy undoubtedly means what it clearly states, namely that all votes in a ballot must be cast without exception, and therefore in absolute uniformity. However, abstention from voting is absolutely permissible, but no propaganda in the form of for or against that is to say yes or no or any other kind of influence before a ballot is permitted and therefore may not take place. But each person casting a vote is obliged to make their own decision as an electoral vote in completely independent intellectual deliberation.
Which I was also allowed to learn from Svath in this regard. And he told and taught me that on Earth, every supposedly free or liberal democracy is a lie and a fraud on the people contrary to what should be effectively truthful. The way the whole thing has developed according to the false worldly patterns of the earthly peoples is completely wrong, because a true democracy includes absolutely general free elections, but never secret elections, as is usual on Earth with alleged democratic elections and secret government elections and other secret elections. This, just as a division of the will of the people into a minority and a majority should also determine the yes and no in elections, meaning that no majority favors, that is to say, wins in this respect, but the minority must inevitably lose. In a democracy, the will of the people alone determines the power of the state, as well as legislation, government officials, and also the administration of justice. And it is not permissible for rulers to be allowed, in any wise whatsoever, to appoint any person to an office of government, because in a democracy, only the people are authorized to do so in accordance with the will of the people, which alone guarantees the fundamental rights of the people. Now, as far as what I have already said is concerned, those of the unrighteous of those in power, who all trump the righteous and noodle, and work against their convictions in order to enforce their injustice in a nasty, wise way, has now also been shown and proven again with the EU dictatorship. So dirty, in fact, that Viktor Orbán, President of Hungary, blocked financial contributions to Zelensky in order to be able to continue the nonsensical, strange Fourth World War, which really is a world war. Because around 50 states, that is to say around 1 to 4 of all states in the world, are indirectly involved on Zelensky's, that is to say, Ukraine's side with arms supplies, ammunition and money. Orban has now been cheated by the rulers of the EU dictatorship and has been convinced to give up his resistance, a donation of around 50 billion euros to Zelensky for the war, precisely because Orban could be bought off and made compliant with a large sum in the billions of euros. However, as far as Christian's article is concerned, he writes the following, which you can read here.
Patient Switzerland Prescriptions for Recovery.
Elaborated by Christian Freiner, Switzerland. The new Switzerland, 200 years ago at the Congress of Vienna, which took place from 18 September 1814 to 9th June 1815, the borders of Switzerland, which are still valid today, were established with the participation of the mighty powers of Europe. At the so-called Second Treaty of Paris on 20th November 1815, the signatory states undertook to guarantee Switzerland's inviolability and independence within these borders. In return, Switzerland undertook to remain neutral in future conflicts. Restoration followed in Switzerland with the Federal Treaty signed by the mighty powers interested in Switzerland's existence. This Federal Treaty formed the basis of international law for the Swiss Confederation of 1815. This very simple basic law was to form the constitutional basis of the Swiss Confederation until 1847. An open and unresolved point of contention was the Sonderbund question. This led to the Sonderbund War in 1847 and ultimately to the replacement of the Federal Treaty by the Federal Constitution in 1848. The Sonderbund War was a civil war in Switzerland. It lasted from 3 to 29 November 1847 and was the last military conflict on Swiss soil. As a result, the Federal Constitution of 12th of September 1848 unified Switzerland from a confederation of states to a federal state. The fact that Switzerland survived the two world wars more or less unscathed is mainly due to the neutrality it exercised, and which was respected by the warring powers.
Switzerland's neutrality.
Neutrality is an absolute concept and state, which means that it cannot be relativized. Pregnancy is also such an absolute concept because either a woman is pregnant or she is not. Practiced neutrality means that no partisanship of any kind is exercised in any wise. Neutrality implies that it applies continuously, that is to say, that it is not applied on a case-by-case basis. Taking sides of any kind, even minimally, is a violation of neutrality and automatically destroys it. Neutrality in a defined area, for example at state or private level, therefore applies comprehensively, without exception and permanently. In international dealings between states, a distinction is made between neutrality law and neutrality policy. This leads to a relativization of neutrality, and therefore to its annulment and destruction, or to the pretense of false facts or self-deception. The fact is that if all states on Earth were neutral towards all others, there would be no interstate wars, and thus finally fertile terrain for the peace on Earth that many have longed for thousands of years. Neutrality that is actually lived and communicated would mean the following for Switzerland. No sanctions, no arms deliveries to warring parties, no membership of alliances that are directed against other states, etc., and that impair our own freedom of choice, no interference of any kind in the circumstances and concerns of other states. Neutrality does, however, allow for mediation missions to be carried out at the specific request of countries at odds with one another. It is also permitted to act in an advisory capacity in response to an official request. Entering into a federation with another country and at the same time maintaining neutrality requires that both countries have the same level of development in terms of legislation, finance, freedom, etc. Both countries must have the same level of development in terms of legislation, etc. Switzerland's neutrality at state level does not restrict economic relations, but expressly permits them, provided that bilateral agreements are concluded on an equal footing. International charitable and sporting relations are also compatible with neutrality, provided that they do not pursue political ends. Likewise, the views and opinions of all private individuals with regard to events at home and abroad are of course not restricted. The fact that practicing neutrality at a private level would prevent a great deal of conflict, suffering and hardship, and even murder and premature death should be added here as food for thought. Switzerland's participation in spring 2022 in the sanctions regime of the Western Power Alliance, NATO, USA, and EU against Russia in connection with the war in Ukraine not only damaged Switzerland's neutrality, it destroyed it. Official Switzerland has, metaphorically speaking, shot itself in the foot and is exposing itself to the world as an example of governmental incompetence and is now crawling around the legs of the masters of the West like a dog begging for recognition. The claim by the USA, the UK and the EU, etc., that the war in Ukraine is in defense of the democracy of the Western community of values stems from a mental state that is aptly depicted in Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. It is also obvious that the EU is clearly not a democracy, but a power political bureaucratic dictatorship, because apart from the eunuch-like EU Parliament, not a single EU body is legitimized as directly elected by the people. As far as NATO is concerned, which will be discussed below, it is an alliance of states founded by the USA after the last World War on the initiative of US President Harry S. Truman as a defense alliance against communism, which, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1990s, has transformed itself into a global offensive alliance that realistically corresponds to a mercenary army of the USA, under whose wing around 30 countries between Iceland and Turkey are now marching along as free riders or vassals.
Switzerland's direct democracy.
In addition to its neutrality status, which was recognized worldwide until recently, Switzerland's second unique selling point in international comparison is its so-called direct democracy. This term summarizes the fact that in Switzerland the sovereign, that is to say the electorate, is explicitly the boss or the political authority that creates or approves the laws and the constitution. However, as the electorate cannot elect or deselect the Federal Council, the so-called executive or government of Switzerland, nor the members of the courts at federal level or the secretaries of state, etc., the special case of Switzerland is not a genuine democracy, but at best a semi-democracy. After all, unlike all other countries in the world, the Swiss population has the right to determine, amend or repeal articles of the Constitution and laws by means of initiative and referendum. In addition, it has become customary in Swiss politics to include the largest parties in government on a proportional basis, concordance, which ensures a certain degree of governmental stability, in contrast to other countries where there is an opposition system linked to ongoing changes of government personnel, which hinders long-term development work.
History.
On 6 December 1992, the Swiss people and cantons voted extremely narrowly, against Switzerland's accession to the European Economic Area, EEA, by 50.3% to 49.7% of the vote, and 18 cantons to 8. This was preceded by a massive build-up of threats by the political establishment and business organizations. The Swiss population was threatened that a rejection of the application for membership would practically lead to Switzerland's economic ruin and a relapse into former poverty. Thanks to the counter-campaign by a small group centered around the Swiss politician of the century, Christoph Blocher, the attempt to join was fended off, with the result that Switzerland has so far at the beginning of 2024 not become a member of either the European Community EC or the European Union EU, and is significantly better off economically, socially, and in terms of freedom than all EU countries. The doom-mongering had turned out to be hollow chatter and an attempt at manipulation by the domestic elites, class politique. And as has since become known, with the release of Federal Council minutes after a 30-year embargo, the behavior of the Federal Council at the time can justifiably be judged as disgraceful, cowardly, and treacherous. At that time, it was about joining the EEA as a kind of training run for joining the EC, and unfortunately, for some time now, people in higher echelons of politics and business have once again been trying to seduce the Swiss population into joining the EU dictatorship, and some have even insidiously joined the war promotion organization NATO by means of renewed threats and the use of so-called salami-slicing tactics. The state as a living organism. A state is a limited area on the surface of the earth, which, in the course of long or short periods of time, often through acts of war, harbors human beings of uniform or different languages, traditions, religions, physical characteristics, ways of life, technical possibilities and uses, as well as culture as a nation and country, and offers them a home. The health of a state is dependent on many factors, including climate, ecosystem, natural resources, education system, culture, sense of community, civilizational progress, life expectancy, healthcare, etc. A state can be described as healthy if individual well-being is in harmony with the common good, if finances are generally in balance, if there is a high level of satisfaction among the population with regard to the balance between the private and public spheres, if freedom of speech is fully respected or intact, if the stronger help the weaker, if personal responsibility and industriousness are practiced as virtues and criminal behavior is minimal and consistently punished.
Health hazards.
The health of every organism is endangered both from the outside and also from the inside. In the case of patient Switzerland, the exogenous threat comes from many different sources, the two most dangerous of which are briefly addressed here with a few aspects. The EU. In the form of all its members, it forms a so-called single market and the Eurozone. The EU is heading for an economic and political fiasco due to the different economic structures and preconditions when it was founded and in the context of enlargements, as well as mismanagement and unrealistic visions euro, etc. The mountains of debt are growing rapidly towards national bankruptcy. As Switzerland, a non-EU member state in the heart of Europe, is utilizing its economic and legal freedom and is still in a better economic position, blackmail threats are being made in an attempt to subjugate or incorporate Switzerland as a good and reliable payer. The USA. The revelations by Julian Assange and Edward Snowden prove that the Anglo-American Secret Service octopus has not only implanted its tentacles in the enemy as an additional nervous system, but also in its friends, the legendary eavesdropping on Angela Merkel's mobile phone by the Americans. Similarly, US internet and technology companies linked to the US intelligence services infiltrate all communication systems worldwide using software and hardware. The USA is brazenly deflecting attention from this fact by brazenly proclaiming a threat from the Chinese and Russians as a threat to the democratic free world. Meanwhile, the USA has been attacking and encroaching on the Swiss financial center for years, dormant assets, banking secrecy, etc., while thunderous silence prevails regarding the financial loopholes in its own country, Delaware, etc. NATO, which has already been mentioned, is functionally an appendage of the US Armed Forces because the US also selects the operational and war zones and is in charge of the missions, coordinates everything, and finances a large part of them. The endogenous threat to Switzerland can also be illustrated by a few examples. As in the run-up to the EEA vote in 1992, political, ideological, and economic forces are also now once again endeavouring to insidiously lead Switzerland into the EU as a partial or full member, or at least to subject it to the decision-making power of the European Court of Justice foreign judges. Due to a lack of education and a lack of logic in the political decision-making bodies, and also in parts of the population, efforts are being made to destroy the high values of direct democracy and neutrality that have been fought for by our ancestors and characterize Switzerland. Joining the EU would inevitably result in damage to direct democracy. The one-sided propaganda and moralism in so-called mainstream journalism and the public service media, which generate images of the enemy instead of illuminating conflicts and events from different perspectives and presenting them in such a way that the population can form its own opinion, is dripping with transatlantic Uncle Sam blindness and is an unacceptable imposition and a nasty attack on the common sense of subscribers and payers of compulsory license fees. Efforts to embed the Swiss army more and more deeply in NATO structures contradict neutrality and lead to a go-along, get-along effect in warlike interventions and in concrete terms to a massive security threat to Switzerland as a party to the war. Refusal of the majority of political councillors at federal level to apply and implement constitutional and legal articles mass initiative. Abuse of asylum, guarantee of property, no arms deliveries to warring parties etc. Preemptive obedience and striving in our dealings with foreign countries, especially the EU and the European Commission on Human Rights. A lack of will to protect Switzerland as an independent state with its own interests and to act courageously and steadfastly. Cowardice in the face of foreign countries and cowardice towards oneself as a citizen. Moralism, do-gooderism and gentleman's riding instead of cooperation and efforts to understand other views, lifestyles and forms of government, etc. Blind AI application. Euphoria and escapism from reality through addictive behavior in the use of electronic devices, which leads to mental stultification by letting others think for themselves instead of thinking and considering everything logically for themselves.
Prescription.
In contrast to individual human beings who, when confronted with an illness or accident, can immediately and directly initiate healing or alleviating measures, etc., provided they can muster the necessary mental and disciplinary strength and motivation. A country that wants to recover in its internal state requires a multitude of measures that need to be coordinated. Priorities must be set and logical sequences planned, which takes time to implement and is to be driven forward in a democracy on the basis of majority decisions. If everything is to proceed in a humane manner, the electorate must be constantly and neutrally informed about the advantages and disadvantages until it dawns on the last redneck that there is a real need for action. The population must be educated to realize that the natural law of cause and effect also applies in Switzerland, and that only with the application of logic, sobriety, determination, and public spirit, etc., can the Swiss cart be pulled out of the mess and put on safe ground. Without a joint effort by a mentally mature majority of the population, no cure is possible. The recipe in brief: A. Genuine neutrality. B. Genuine democracy. C. Peacefulness. D. Legal certainty. E. Sound. Finances F. Personal responsibility and resilience. A. Genuine neutrality. Switzerland's damaged neutrality is to be fully restored at state level without delay. This means, among other things, Switzerland declares officially and worldwide that it will permanently exercise strict neutrality at all levels with immediate effect, and that it requests all countries to respect this. All existing sanctions are to be lifted immediately. So-called circumvention deals are not permitted. Switzerland withdraws from the UN, as it is being misused as an instrument of political power Security Council with veto power, and represents a largely religious ideological debating club. Swiss membership of all political party organizations is banned at constitutional level. An exception is membership of a necessary successor organization to the UN. Provided that all other countries on Earth have become members, that all countries are equal in this organization, and that only unanimous decisions apply, holding votes is acceptable. Switzerland cancels its membership of the European Commission of Human Rights and its Court of Justice, and also its membership of the Council of Europe. The provisions of the Geneva Convention continue to apply. However, globally active organizations such as the UN, UNICEF, the Olympic Committee, etc. are still permitted to have their headquarters in Switzerland, provided they do not interfere in Switzerland's internal affairs. Bilateral economic agreements between Switzerland and other countries are still possible if the interests, rights and obligations of the contracting parties are balanced, if the agreement can be terminated, and if the legislative powers of the Swiss people are not impaired. There is a strict separation between state and religion, which means that state institutions may not enter into any financial or service-related cooperation with churches and ideological communities, etc., as this is the only way to guarantee Switzerland's neutrality as a state. Religion is a private matter, as is ideology. Switzerland will continue to provide its good offices as an impartial mediator to all willing countries on request.
A. Genuine democracy.
Switzerland will be the first country in the history of the earth to introduce and also live a genuine democracy. To this end, the Constitution is to be expanded as follows. In addition to the National Council and the Council of States, which will be retained in their current form in terms of numbers, the electorate will now also elect the Federal Council and the courts at federal level for a term of proposed 10 years. Re-election is not possible. The minimum age for election at federal level is proposal 40 years. In order to ensure a certain amount of previous professional and gainful employment and life experience. The election procedure for the National Council and Council of States will be changed so that the persons elected to the seats allocated to the canton in question are those who have received the most votes across all party boundaries. This principle also applies at cantonal and communal level. List combinations are no longer permitted. The Federal Council is elected by the people from a group of persons who are deemed suitable for the leadership task by a specialized committee, which is also elected by the people for a limited period. There is a single ballot. The 7 persons with the highest number of votes are elected. The judge candidates are also examined for suitability by a specialized committee elected by the people for a limited period of time. However, the election is not carried out by the panel, but by lot, because the people lack the necessary expertise. Once the political reorganization is complete, political parties are dissolved because the welfare of Switzerland as a social system and independent state is the maxim in every respect, not ideological and religious particular interests. Elected persons serve only the good of the population as a whole. In the event of repeated offences, a person is to be removed from office immediately, with the replacement from the last election taking their place. That is to say, the person with the highest number of votes of those not elected. The principle of subsidiarity still applies, which means that what can be regulated and decided at municipal level should also be done there, that is to say, within the direct sphere of influence of the local electorate.
A. Peacefulness.
Switzerland's armed neutrality, which has so far been propagated both internally and externally, is to be transformed or developed into an unarmed neutrality.
1. Justification.
A country without an army is a country in which peaceful coexistence is not only symbolic, but exemplary. Such a decision by the people is a sign of strength and a humane certificate of maturity, and not utopian fervor or weakness. A country without an army is a country that is not in danger of being destroyed by a foreign army, because where there is no armed defense, destruction is pointless. The principle is based on the logic that military defense guarantees destruction, death, and hardship in one's own country in the event of a military attack from outside. Realistically speaking, the Swiss army is far too small and incapable of fending off a massive attack using air and missile weapons anyway. And anyone flirting with guerrilla warfare in the densely populated area of Switzerland should visualize the example of the Gaza Strip. The likelihood of one of the 5 surrounding countries attacking and occupying Switzerland is extremely low. Contrary to the propaganda based on Russophobia and the Cold War mentality in the Western community of values, including its press, which accuses Russia of imperial behavior, thirst for conquest. Realistically speaking, the probability of Russia attacking and occupying a truly neutral, impartial Switzerland is practically zero, for the following reasons. 1. Russia is not the Soviet Union, which, as the Warsaw Pact, not unfoundedly set itself apart from the Western victorious powers after the World War. 2. Russia is not an imperial country like the USA, as with its huge land area, and many peoples it is busy enough with itself to keep everything together peacefully and protect its borders. 3. Russia is practically the only self-sufficient country on Earth in terms of energy, ores and agriculture, etc., so it can exist independently of other countries. 4. Russia is not even in a position in terms of personnel to occupy and control the European countries militarily, and in terms of infrastructure, especially also because probably over 90% of the Russian population does not speak German, English, French or Spanish, etc., which makes permanent occupation impossible. Russia understandably does not tolerate US missiles in the buffer zone along its borders, from Finland to Ukraine, Georgia to Kazakhstan and beyond, just as the USA would never tolerate this if China or Russia were to set up missiles in Mexico or Canada. NB. The war in Ukraine is a kind of warlike anomaly, because compared to the 2 world wars and the subsequent wars waged by the USA, NATO, Korea, Vietnam,
Libya,
Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Serbia, Somalia, and currently in the Middle East. In Ukraine, for the first time and exceptionally, it is not the civilian population that is suffering the greatest blood toll as collateral damage, but the soldiers on both sides. The reason for this is that Russia is not waging a war against the Ukrainian population, and obviously does not want to annex the whole country, but is fighting against the corrupt Bandera regime and its presidential arms beggar, who are seeking NATO membership, which would mean missiles on Russia's borders. The proxy war between NATO and Russia in Ukraine, with the unilateral massive arms deliveries, propaganda and sanctions on an unprecedented scale, etc., can indeed be described as a strange and unconventional world war. In the unlikely event that Switzerland were to be occupied by a foreign might, it is already clear that this would not last, as history proves, namely that every great or conquering power has reached its zenith, but has then withered and disappeared. The stupid saying, "better dead than unfree," is evidence of ideological fanaticism and a lack of self-responsibility towards one's own life. Because after all, what counts first and foremost is freedom of thought, that is to say, inner freedom, which also works when walls and bars are erected all around. Anyone who looks at the overall political situation on Earth without mental blinkers, which is hardly fully comprehensible in its complexity, sees clear signs of the emergence of a multipolar world of countries, the civilizational decline of the USA, the economic and political rotting of the EU dictatorship, and growing explosive dissatisfaction among the populations due to the incompetent and ideologically contaminated government figures. And the fact that the NATO threat backdrop will be permanently disfigured beyond recognition is unavoidable due to the imminent total military defeat of the Western powers in Ukraine.
1. Measures.
The Swiss militia army is to be successively disbanded and transformed into a relief and disaster protection organization that can be deployed competently and effectively in the event of future natural disasters. The police and border protection forces, which are responsible for protecting the Swiss population and are clearly authorized and responsible for this by law, will remain officially armed. The organization, numbers and equipment of these protective forces must be adapted to the threat situation and the need for order. The elimination of military expenditure means that the necessary financial resources are available. With regard to weapons and their use, priority is given to non-lethal systems, that is to say, weapons that disable human beings but do not kill them. The people elect a supervisory body to ensure that attempts towards a police and surveillance state are recognized in the early stages and reported to the people. All heavy weapons such as tanks, howitzers, and other offensive weapons are to be scrapped. Where appropriate, military sites can be upgraded into recreational areas for the population or as retreats for flora and fauna.
D. Legal certainty.
Based on the above measures, the federal constitution is to be supplemented with corresponding articles. In particular, it must be explicitly stated that any endeavour to restrict the rights of the electorate as the sovereign of Switzerland is prohibited and must be punished without exception. All planned constitutional and legislative amendments must be scrutinized in advance to determine what benefits they will bring and what advantages and disadvantages will result from their introduction. This should be done in a neutral wise and formulated in such a way that the electorate can make up its own mind and make an informed and free decision accordingly. Existing laws and constitutional provisions must be complied with, or adapted or repealed if there is a need for action over time and in line with progress. The meaning and intention of a law must be taken into account when interpreting it. That is to say, a paragraph by paragraph approach should be avoided. Justice, equal treatment, and the individual and overall welfare are always at the center. Criminal law applies to all residents of the country to the same extent. No special legal immunities or privileges apply to persons elected by the people. Immigrants from abroad who wish to work and/or settle here must fulfill certain conditions. Language, income, self-sufficiency, law abidance within a specified period of time in order to be allowed to remain in Switzerland. Those who do not have a legal right of residence in Switzerland may not receive any direct financial support. Survival until departure may only be ensured through material contributions, vouchers for food and emergency accommodation. Punitive measures are based on the principle of victim protection before offender protection, and resocialization, yes, but only with genuine effort. In case of doubt, society's need for security always prevails.
D. Healthy finances.
The principle applies: earn and save first, then spend. The aim of the state must be to minimize the tax burden on the population, which means that the state only takes on tasks and incurs expenditure that have been determined by the people, and that are necessary to ensure the overall welfare of the population both internally and externally. As long as a monetary economy still prevails on Earth, supervision lies with the state, which, together with the National Bank, intervenes immediately if the overall welfare of the country or the municipalities, etc., is jeopardized. The state ensures that private property is protected and that the possibility of making purchases, etc., anonymously using cash remains secure in monetary transactions. This freedom is also to be ensured vis-à-vis foreign countries, that is to say, citizens are to be protected against access from abroad. The authorities must take all precautions to ensure that buying and selling is also possible without panic in the event of a long-term power blackout. Mortgages to finance the construction and renovation of buildings, etc., must be lower in amount than the necessary equity capital saved. The next generation is to be taught at home or at school at the latest how to handle money in a financially responsible manner so that the risk of later debt and financial mismanagement is minimized.
D. Personal responsibility and resilience.
The state of health of a state or country is reflected in the mental, physical, and civilizational state of its population. In other words, if public spirit, a desire for freedom, helpfulness, openness, reliability, industriousness, skepticism, thriftiness, love of nature, sobriety, a willingness to learn and reason as well as a long-term perspective, etc., are practiced to a large extent by the population, then these are the best conditions for a healthy state and a free society. A healthy, vibrant, and livable Swiss state therefore requires human beings who are committed, interested, predominantly mentally healthy, and who take a critical look at any planned legislation and bear their civic responsibility. In addition to the causes and threats listed above, the fact that Switzerland is currently in a state of illness has to do with the fact that there are many parasitic germs at work within the country that do not actively protect and promote the well-being of Switzerland as an orderly and valued homeland, but instead buck due to self-hatred and inferiority complexes, etc., and believe that they can find their salvation in a foreign ideological mirage. The recovery of Switzerland as a polity and living community is fundamentally made possible by the fact that, on the one hand, human beings cultivate a lifelong self-education, and, on the other, by devoting the necessary seriousness and consistency to education at home and at school. Which means, among other things, setting a good example, that is to say, cultivating a decent way of life, decent language, good manners, tolerance, understanding, and loving care. To make an effort to go through the world with an open mind and attentiveness in order to learn to distinguish belief and opinion from reality, and also to avoid falling prey to low intelligence through propaganda and proselytizing and becoming remote-controlled mental zombies. Children should be treated from birth as fully fledged human beings who, in their eagerness to learn, constantly ask questions that should be answered favorably to the best of their knowledge and without missionary excess, and, if an answer is not known, that this should also be honestly admitted. Children must be given the opportunity to gain experiences in the great outdoors and to learn through social interaction with other children to be considerate, but also to assert themselves and to practice relinquishment, etc. During the first 7 years, children should be protected from unaccompanied use of any electronic media, TV, internet, games, so that they can discover and develop their own imaginative capacities and inner creativity, etc. As soon as children ask questions about dying and death, the reality must be explained to them in an age-appropriate way, which is also the case when questions arise about the creation and procreation of human beings. This is important so that children can realize at an early age that life is finite and that they have to learn to deal with loss and death in their lives, which means that it is worthwhile to always use their lifetime for learning not only school knowledge, but also virtues, and not to waste it on wanting to appear and accumulating trinkets. But children also have to learn that being a responsible adult means not becoming a parent as a teenager, but first learning a profession and gaining life experience. And if, after reaching the age of 30, there is a desire to have children and a loving, reliable partner with a strong character has been found, it is important to consider very carefully whether the circumstances are suitable for having a child at all, or at most 2, and then being committed to raising and caring for them together for around 20 years. This is based on the fact that global population growth, and in Switzerland, mass immigration, is the fundamental evil that is constantly exacerbating all other major problems and making them even more intractable, namely by increasing the number of consumers of resources and polluters of emissions immeasurably, and making our Earth more and more diseased through depletion. And it must be clearly and repeatedly communicated to children and adolescents that problems can only be solved if they are tackled at their root cause, which in terms of saving the planet is only possible if the number of births is much lower than the number of deaths for the time being, with a global target of less than 1 billion human beings. Even a primary school pupil understands that constant quantitative growth on a limited area is not intelligent or sustainable. Children must also be taught that it is a fact that human beings are responsible for everything they do or do not do, and that the feelings and emotions they feel are triggered by their own thinking. For example, if he thinks confidently and calmly, then he has different feelings and moods than if he is stressed or allows stress from outside, or if he mistakenly sees himself as the poorest human being in the world. And if he knows that what has happened cannot be undone, this may encourage him to focus on what can and should be done positively in the future on an ongoing basis. Every person resident in Switzerland, woman or man or hermaphrodite, must perform at least 1 year's civilian service between the ages of 20 and 30 for the benefit of fellow human beings and society and/or nature. with the costs of accommodation, food, insurance, etc. being borne by the state. Pregnancy is not considered a reason for exemption, in contrast to significant mental and/or physical disability, impairment. The aim of this service is for young human beings to develop a sense for the common good and make a meaningful contribution. For example, in caring for dependent and lonely persons, whose numbers are expected to increase as a result of demographic trends. Alternatively, manual soil cultivation can be practiced in the agricultural sector. Reforestation oxygen donors can be carried out, or maintenance work can be carried out in biodiversity areas, etc., etc. Basically, everything must be done to ensure that the next generation sees a meaning in life, that they learn skills to deal competently with the problems and demands of technology and society, and to learn to understand a text that consists not only of short sentences of 5 to 6 words, as has been the case in many newspapers for many years, but, like the current text here, with sentences that span several lines. Finally, children and adolescents must be educated and trained or taught to be careful not to get lost in virtual worlds and to let artificial intelligence, AI, think for them. This also means that they realize the danger that if they delegate their inspiration and creativity to AI, they will gradually and imperceptibly lose their capacity for reason and intellect and leave their brains to atrophy. Side note, this essay was written 100% without the use of AI.
Conclusions.
Anyone who has endeavored to read all of the above recommendations for improvement, and if you have endeavored to read and reflect on all of the healing recommendations listed above, and draw your own conclusions and consider further consequences, you will realize that it is basically possible to heal Switzerland's ailing health, but only if the toxins affecting the individual organs are massively reduced and the immune system is strengthened at the same time, which, as with human beings, is mainly possible by cultivating healthy, uplifting, and realistic thoughts, which can keep the psyche in a balanced and harmonious state. Such a mental state leads to increased resilience in the face of all kinds of potential problems and dangers, which it is not possible to avoid in a world that is increasingly out of joint. The human being who does not sit at the levers of political, military and economic leadership still has the freedom to remove himself from the herd of the mainstream masses, drifting somnambulistically along on solid ground in such a way that a neutral, realistic and expedient determination of his position becomes possible. In this way, strategies and behaviors, as well as an attitude of awareness, can be developed that are geared towards preserving one's own lifetime in the long term on the one hand, and, on the other, to maximizing one's own private scope for decision-making and defending private self-sufficiency. This means, among other things, that precautionary measures are introduced and implemented to prevent oneself from being one of the first victims of impending social and environmental calamities and suffering damage to property, life and limb. To give a few concrete examples, this means that aspects such as living in vulnerable areas, taking part in violent demonstrations, lack of emergency supplies, etc., can either be neglected or purposefully improved. And Maxim no. One still applies. Concentrate on what can be personally changed through personal initiative, and take interested, conscious, and thoughtful note of what cannot be directly influenced, but is nevertheless worth keeping an eye on.
These are exceptionally good and clear words of explanation and the true state of affairs. But to understand this is not possible for those regarding their lack of intelligentum who violate and overall do not understand what neutrality means.
That applies to certain persons in Bern, even in the Federal Council, National Council, and Council of States, who prove their political incompetence and unfitness. And such elements are unfortunately in government and feel great and powerful. But no one ever tells them the truth and reveals to them that they are nothing but lowly intelligent and therefore non-thinking idiots. But when they are told the truth, they feel affected, and that is because they themselves do not recognize their bean-straw stupidity. But look here and please read. There is another article by our former federal counselor Christoph Blocher, who was ousted from the federal palace. He lets his hair down and says what needs to be said, which of course does not please that part of the government in Bern that is unlawful, treacherous to the country, makes a pig of our national neutrality, or colludes with the EU dictatorship, and begins to make a pig of Switzerland's sovereignty, undermining it and selling it to the EU dictatorship in order to let foreign idiots rule our country. Which is already happening with what may come, if what irresponsible louts from Bern have already negotiated with the EU dictatorship becomes reality.
The world is crazy. We are standing up to it. Defend independence. Stop mass immigration.
HF. For the 36th time, former federal counselor Christoph Blocher delivered his striking, groundbreaking Albus-Gütli speech last Friday. This time under the title, "The World is Crazy. We are Standing Up to It." He castigated the neglect of the Western world in particular, and especially the gigantically indebted EU. It was all the more idiotic that the political class wanted to subject our country to this misconstruction and was prepared to give up our unique, successful form of government to do so. He and the SVP would do everything in their power to prevent this from happening. We stand against it. We are publishing the memorable speech in abridged form below. Unfortunately, it will be Blocher's last Albus-Gütli speech. Ladies and gentlemen, a look at the Western world, and the EU in particular, shows that this world has come apart at the seams. This world is off the rails. It is going crazy. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, the so-called leaders claimed in 1989 that there would be no more war. And what do we see today? War has returned to Europe, which we normal human beings had foreseen. The Middle East is experiencing an unimaginable return of brutality. Nobody wanted to see this obvious possibility of Hamas, not even the Israeli government. And the West only wants to do business with countries that share its so-called values. It would be better to trade globally and thus make our planet more peaceful. But if we look at the EU, and in particular at its paymaster Germany, the mountain of debt has increased more than tenfold since 1980, from 240 billion euros to 2,500 billion. Not only does Germany pay a lot to the EU, it also has a debt of 1,000 billion euros. And the Federal Council, the majority of Parliament, and also the business associations want to drive Switzerland into such an entity? This is not just a spin, it is idiotic.
And Switzerland.
For many foreigners, we live on an island of bliss. Why? Not because we are better or smarter, but because we have a better form of government. In short, because we are still independent and because the final say in legislation lies with the electorate and the cantons. This means that politicians can do less low intelligence. And it is precisely this strength that the Swiss authorities want to abolish. There is a great danger that Switzerland is also starting to spin. Certainly, Swiss debt is somewhat lower than in other countries, but it is also dangerously too high. Politicians are trying to loosen and circumvent the debt brake, another of Switzerland's strengths. They are searching day and night for ways to increase taxes, levies, and fees even more. The left now wants tax increases quickly and with amateurish recipes. Its goad is the Juso, which is demanding an inheritance tax for the rich. The SP, the Greens, and the still wavering Center and GLP form the main opposition. The Popular Initiative calls for a 50% inheritance tax on assets over CHF 50 million. Sounds good, does it not? It would only affect a few people. But the initiators have forgotten these wealthy people who are to be penalized, for the most part entrepreneurs, belong to the top 1% of taxpayers, who account for 40% of tax revenue. I can predict one thing. Nobody will pay this inheritance tax. Those affected will ensure that they either no longer have assets worth 50 million when they inherit, or that they move their place of residence abroad. Either way, they will also no longer pay the annual ordinary taxes in Switzerland. Once again, the middle class would have to pay. As a farmer, I learned that you do not take the best dairy cows to the butcher, you milk them. But the left is doing the opposite with the good taxpayers. As you can see, the world is also going crazy in Switzerland. Our solid country is increasingly being undermined by the left, in other words, by socialism. That is why countermeasures are the recommendation of the hour.
No to the 13th AHV pension.
We will be called to the polls on 3rd March. Of course, it would be nice to receive a 13th AHV pension. As an AHV recipient, I would also like a 14th and 15th. And yet we have to say no. Because as a responsible civic party, we ask, who should pay for this? Do we want even more wage deductions, that is to say, lower net wages for everyone, and yet even more expensive production costs? Or do we want higher taxes? That means more inflation and less to live on for everyone. No and no again, ladies and gentlemen. The SVP wants to save the AHV, not destroy it. On the security of Switzerland. Switzerland was spared terrible world wars thanks to the tried and tested Swiss policy of neutrality. 200 years without war. Someone should imitate us. But instead of upholding this strength, Switzerland is also taking EU sanctions against a warring party, a nuclear power, and becoming a warring party itself. That is why we launched the Neutrality Initiative. It is a decisive counterattack against the warmongers in the federal palace. Wherever we look, what has stood the test of time is being pushed aside in an adolescent manner. Conceited snobs, self-important greenhorns, and arrogant, immature university graduates are eliminating solid political craftsmanship. As you can see, Switzerland is also starting to go mad. The SVP urgently needs to take countermeasures. The country needs the SVP.
Main threats.
The main threats to our country continue to be excessive population growth and the surrender of independence. The exorbitant population growth is finally to be curbed, as we have been demanding for years. Excessive immigration is the root of all evil. If nothing happens in Parliament again, even though all the legal foundations are in place, the 2027 elections is the time to remedy the situation. Then, ladies and gentlemen, it will be Rabel. I already have ideas in my head. Fight for independence against colonial treaties. In 1992, the Classe Politique did everything it could to drive Switzerland into the EEA and the EU. But the authorities did not take the Zurich SVP into account. Here in the Albisguetli Hall, the SVP was the first and only party to take part in a memorable counter-constitutional meeting on 3rd of July 1992. It clearly voted against joining the EEA-EU and thus came out clearly in favor of a free, direct democratic sovereign Switzerland. It was the decisive blow against EEA-EU accession. That is why this hall is the modern Rütli. It is Switzerland's most famous shooting lodge with the motto, "Exercise your eyes and hands for the fatherland." During the referendum campaign, we opponents of EU membership were vilified and denigrated by the authorities, the administration, business organizations, and the Journalists' Guild. But we took comfort in the words of Frederick the Great, who said, "He who has many monkeys around him is also often bitten." There are also more than enough monkeys like that today, but our fight was worth it. With a record turnout of 78.3%, the majority of voters and two-thirds of the cantons voted in favor of Swiss independence and thus against joining the EEA and the EU. Without this success, we would be a member of the European Union today. Unfortunately, however, the class politique also continued to work on surrendering Swiss independence after 1992 with the Swiss-EU Framework Agreement. But the Federal Council realized that the Swiss people would never approve this treaty and buried it itself in May 2021.
Give up on a successful Switzerland.
But as Schiller said, this is the curse of evil deeds, that they must always give birth to evil. The classe politique belonging to the EU is also not resting today. On 15th of December 2023, the Federal Council came up trumps. It was aiming for a package solution, no longer a framework agreement. Instead of framing Switzerland, it is now to be wrapped up. But it is exactly the same colonial treaty. It is to be perfidiously divided into 7 treaties, 7 colonial treaties, probably to wear down opponents and the Swiss people. Once again, as in 1992 and 2021, the aim is to ensure that the EU enacts Swiss laws in future and that the EU Court of Justice makes the final decision. The Swiss people and Swiss sovereignty are to be eliminated. This step is even more incomprehensible today than it was in 1992, as this attack is being launched against a Switzerland that is at the top of all rankings. They want to give up a successful Switzerland that is doing better than other countries. If the Federal Council and Parliament even manage to overturn the referendum on the package solution with Brussels, which the center-left majority is likely to do, the 2027 elections will end badly for them. Then the key question will be, do you citizens still want politicians who will abandon Switzerland and take away your right to vote? And even more people will vote for the SVP.
Conclusion.
The SVP can be proud of what it has already achieved. In 1977, when I took over the leadership of the SVP in the canton of Zurich, it had a voter share of 9.9% across Switzerland. Today, the SVP Switzerland is by far the strongest party in the country with 28%. In addition, on 6 December 1992, we won the vote of the century on EEA-EU accession and saved Switzerland's independence. And in 2021, the framework agreement was withdrawn under pressure from the SVP. Let another party copy that first.
Stay vigilant.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is no room for faint-heartedness and displeasure. But we must remain vigilant and also constantly admonish susceptible persons in our own ranks so that the successful SVP does not become a club of career politicians. At the beginning of the political year, let us reflect on the following saying, which I discovered on a hike. It is the oath of the valley authorities in Tavers, Fribourg, from 1622. We have by the grace of God a beautiful Freiheit. We have our own might and violence to set. We are, thank God, neither indebted nor subject to any pious prince or lord, but to Almighty God alone. May God help us in our great tasks. Long live Switzerland, Christoph Blocher.
It is good, but apparently it is also not possible there without an unreal G.
Excuse me. Yes. But that is not important, because you know that this has nothing to do with the whole thing, just as it is also the case that the Earthling's faith is sacred. It also has nothing to do with the fact that there are some incompetent elements in the government in Bern, just like in any other government in any other country in the world. Either there are some young or old politicians who know nothing at all about governing and just want to exercise power, or they just want and create new laws, reforms, rules, and crazy regulations through low intelligence and might, which will bring disaster and increasingly restrict the freedom of the people. Only a small part, an absolute minority of those in power really want to govern in a good and fair way for the good of the people and the country, and keep everything in good shape. But it is precisely these people who are beaten down by the majority of the unrighteous, power-mad and loud-mouthed and simply screwed over in a lousy and nasty way against their will to such an extent that they have to say yes and amen to everything, whether they like it or not. And if I openly say what is true, then I am not politicizing, but only saying what corresponds to the truth and is therefore an effective fact. As is also the case in many other countries, that incompetence and certain power-hungry people are romping around in governments. This section of those in power, however, destroys everything that the truly righteous in government intend to do that is good and worthwhile for the people and for peace. But their convictions in this regard are so meanly denied and undermined by those obsessed with might and main that it becomes impossible for them to assert themselves. This can be seen particularly well in Germany, where neo-Nazis in disguise are at work in the government, using all means of lies and deceit to deny as right-wing extremists all those who really want peace, freedom and righteousness for the country and the people, and who are slandered by the neo-Nazi rulers, just as the people's believers in the government are also incited in this way. Of course, this is unavoidable, for the sake of truth. There are indeed a certain number of right-wing extremists at work everywhere, as in the governments themselves, who have certain evil neo-Nazi airs, like that part of those in power, which, however, falsely hypocrites its neo-Nazism to the outside world with lies and deceit as a force for the people, for peace and freedom, and for the good of the country. This is despite the fact that this part, like many right-wing extremists, anti-Semites and also xenophobes, persecutes, murders, and harms human beings because of their beliefs or destroys their belongings with hatred and wantonness. What goes on in the governments of certain countries is, in a hidden way, similar to the way bailiwicks caused a furore in the past, but also to the way feudal rule was conducted in the Middle Ages, to which, however, as a result of lies and deceit as well as hatred and revenge by some scribblers, quite evil things were attributed that had neither hand nor foot, and therefore did not correspond to the truth. This mainly took the form of the jus primae noctis. I have just looked this up today because I was asked about it, and therefore know how it is written, as brides allegedly had to sleep with princes and landlords the night after the wedding, and some daughters of the bourgeoisie had to sleep with them first, because this was allegedly enshrined in law. This was and is a barefaced lie and a written fraud of an authorship that traced back to an idiotic, vindictive historian and writer called Hector Boethius in 1526, who also invented an imaginary king he called Evenus. Since then, his lie has haunted the world to this day, with which he wanted to pillory the wickedness of feudalism. After all, feudalism was based on an unjust form of society and economy that granted the aristocratic upper class the full, and thus all ruling functions, including land ownership, and much more besides. It is clear that religious faith also played a major role in this, as the control of religiously devout human beings by the unrighteous upper class made the citizens cower. Even then, as also in earlier times, the masses of the people, because of their religious faith and their ignorance, surrendered without resistance to the subjugation and subordination by the authorities and parried submissively. Consequently, they bowed more and more to their emerging and restrictive laws, rules, regulations, and ordinances, as a result of which the freedom of human beings was increasingly curtailed, and they lost their sense of self-determination with regard to correctness and incorrectness. What remains to be said is the following. Weapons production has been a crime against humanity since time immemorial, because weapons production has always and repeatedly promoted war and terror, as well as crime, murderous crimes, and murder and manslaughter among human beings from the normal population. The industry of weapons production and the like should be banned worldwide, as should those companies and corporations that made billions from it by raking in billions during the corona rampantly spreading disease by throwing untested FIGU, that is to say poisons, onto the market, which killed more than 22 million human beings. The same style is now likely to continue with long COVID, as FIGU are again being administered that are probably useless. It should also be said that long COVID means that the mutated, rampantly spreading disease has entered the bloodstream and will never disappear again.
That will probably be as you say, but now I have something else to discuss with you that should be purely private and therefore not retrieved and written down by you.
Then so be it. But still this question. I was with your father Svath in a castle in India. I do not remember what it was called. Note. Kumbhalgarh Fortress. It was on a small mountain, around which a steeply rising, large and very long stone wall is built in a serpentine shape, that is to say, like a snake. So it is a castle with a wall, but it is a huge wall, and that is why I mention it, because compared to the Great Wall of China, which is 21,296 kilometers long, this wall is, as Svath said, the second longest known stone wall in the world. I do not know, because there is still a lot I have not read in my father's annals. Billy. What a pity, but I would like to show you some of the lovely, kind, and very interesting letters, etc. I received for my 87th birthday. If I may hold 2 or 3 in front of your eyes?
Nothing stands in the way of that. Quite the opposite. I am interested in what is sent to you.
Then I want to show you these 2 things, that is to say the poem-like letters. Here you go.
A life for the truth.
A life for the truth means that a person, the human being, strives to understand reality in connection with all its creational, natural laws and recommendations, and consciously perceive it, to realize it in his life, and thereby become a valuable, happy human being.
The 30th of January, 2024, Eddie Erner. Belgium,